Hello and welcome. This is the last open news meeting that we're going to be holding in 2021. I think because Christmas just keeps on getting earlier, or we just get knackered sooner. But it feels as though, like some great conurbation of time, 2020 and 2021 have elided into each other. And so it's Christmas time. It's time to, indeed, we're celebrating, or in fact not celebrating, but reporting last year's Christmas party. This year, there's a whole muddle of time that's happening. And in that spirit, we're doing our last week of think-ins, revving up for the next year that starts that first week of January. But for the last open news meeting, we thought we would direct traffic a little bit and try to make sense of what happened to the Prime Minister in 2021, what we learned about Boris Johnson, and what that signals for the year ahead. This is a good time to make bold predictions as we go into the Merry Christmas season, because we'll have largely forgotten them by January. But it also feels like a good time for it because things feel much less settled in British politics than they did even 3 months ago at the time of the Conservative Party conference, when for the first time that I could remember, the leader of the Conservative Party faced no real challenge from anywhere, not obviously from the opposition, not from another party, not from within the ranks of his own party. And yet 2-3 months later, things feel much less certain. And so I'm delighted that Eleanor Margolis and Phil Collins are here to try and help us make sense. I'm going to be a tag team with my colleague Matt Dancona to try and make sense of this, but most importantly, we'd love to hear from you. I see some people here who are going to have probably wiser insights than any of us. Let's make sure that we hear from as many people as possible. You by now know the drill, and if you don't, it's really simple. Put your digital hand up or message me in the chat, and I'll make sure to bring you in. In the course of this hour, we'd like to come away with either some juicy pieces of gossip or some profound insights or some leads to follow next year. Any of the three would be great. All three means we've won the lottery. Eleanor Margolis, why don't you start? How did your view, your understanding, your impression of Boris Johnson change in 2021?
I'm not sure it changed per se. I mean, I already had a pretty low opinion of him from 2020. I mean, I think he's, going back to the Peppa Pig gate, there's definitely been a sort of decline of some sort in his ability to do his job. But yeah, I mean, I think my impression of him from this year, more so than ever, is that he is incompetent and not in any way equipped to do his job.
So it's interesting because I suppose I've known him for a long time, probably not as kind of well as either Matt or Phil, but I've known him for a long time. And something did change for me, Eleanor, in one sense, is that I came to think of him as much more Mediterranean, in the sense that I thought that, to my surprise, he's led his government leftward out of Brexit, not to the right, certainly on economic policy. He's been much more prone to be presidential, or assume kind of presidential style in his politics. Don't care about the rules, don't care about the standards, don't care so much about the allegations. Much more of that. And that's not exactly the politician that had been A, much beloved of the right, and B, so convivial within the parliamentary party. He seemed to have stepped away with it. So I did think that something did change with him beyond obviously the personal. You?
I think it's interesting what you say about the presidential style. I think, yeah, that is something that's starting to, I don't know, become clear. I mean, as well as the fact that, like, personally, I would draw a lot of comparisons between him now and Trump in his final year as president. just in his, we're at the point now where people are starting to question his mindset and his mental health and wonder what is going on with him. It all seems quite familiar.
Well, why don't I'm going to go around and ask Phil and Matt, and I'd love to hear from as many people in the room as possible. Phil, what did you learn of Boris Johnson this year?
I think, go back to where you started about time. I think political time has been very stretched recently, very peculiar, because you go back to 2016 and in a sense nothing's happened because everything has been so dominated first by Brexit and then by COVID that politics has been very peculiar. And every politician, though, has a kind of half-life. And Boris Johnson's time has been stretched by the peculiar circumstances. But I think during this year, we've begun to see the beginnings, perhaps only the beginnings, but we've begun to see the beginnings of the things with which we will charge him eventually. You always think to look forward to what will get a politician in the end. What is it that will cause them to fall eventually? Because they all fall eventually. Virtually nobody leaves of their own volition. And what is it that will cause Johnson to fall? Well, it will be his lack of seriousness, probably rather than outright corruption. And I think the fact that he probably has no anchor at all. So you're surprised that he's become this politician who's cavalier, with no regard for democratic procedures, which I, like Ellen, I think is absolutely terrible. I think I'm not so surprised by that because I didn't believe him in his previous incarnation either. When he was the free trade mayor of London, well, I didn't believe that was actually a deep anchoring for Boris Johnson. That was just the part he was playing in that particular movie. Boris Johnson is part of the entertainment industry and he's moved on to a different film now and he's playing a slightly different part. And he's a character actor. And there's also an aspect of that which is a compliment to him because having a character in politics is a great thing to have and not everybody has it. And he has great character. And I think this year, the whole list of the litany of things we've already described, the things that happened to him, when you've got an accompanying purpose, those things are like adornments. They're the character that allow you to get things through. And he's had a purpose, obviously, in Brexit, and then he's had a purpose of sorts in combating the pandemic. And though we're not through that yet, we're glimpsing the point at which we're through it. And at this point, I think that those very same character events, which will happen again and again and again, cease to be adornments because there's no purpose. And that, I think, is what's changed for Boris Johnson over the course of the year, that gradually and slowly politics is returning. And he doesn't have anything to do. He doesn't know who he is, and he doesn't know what he wants. Mm-hmm. The Levelling Up white paper was meant to have been published by now. It's going to be after Christmas. I mean, we're 2 years in, we've got nothing. And that, I think, is what we learned, that he is essentially empty. He's kind of like Peter Sellers, who was fantastic when he was playing a part, but if he's on Parkinson as Peter Sellers, he's a total shell. And that's what I think we're beginning to learn. I wouldn't say that's an advanced process yet with the public. I think that is something for people who know him more, and I'm extrapolating. So I wouldn't say, this is not my diagnosis of where we are in politics now, but I think we're seeing the beginnings of that. And that is what I think might unfold over the next 2 years.
Phil, can I ask you a question? What are we allowed to know about your involvement, or possibly none, in Keir Starmer's conference speech?
Well, I mean, you've rather assumed my answer in your question. the principle of petitio principii, that's called. I was involved. It's no great secret. Okay. I was involved.
So can I ask you a question then? So assuming you're involved, without getting you too much, without congratulating you on the "I was also the son of a toolmaker" joke, can I ask you a question, which was, what's the judgment in the extent to which the Labour leader goes after the character and reputation of the Prime Minister versus the record of the party and government versus cost of living and the circumstances of the country?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think the ideal scenario is always that you can bring all those things together, where the character of the Prime Minister becomes a metaphor decline of the government. There was a precise decision made, in not just in that speech, but in other communications too by the leader of the opposition, to try and dial down the corruption and malignity on the part of the Prime Minister, and to dial up the accusations of triviality and lack of seriousness, which then link more directly to a lack of competence. And the reason for that is whether or not you think Boris Johnson is malign and bad and all of that, the public don't think that. And it's not a good strategic decision to do that. And so therefore, to argue, because bear in mind, when you criticize somebody for whom someone's just voted, you're also implicitly criticizing those voters. You're saying, in effect, you voted for someone who's evil. And that's a very poor way of persuading you. So it's much better, also to my mind, also closer to the point, to say this man lacks serious purpose. He doesn't have anything he's in politics for other than his own advancement. And this is going to show up in poor government. And so when we do face crises like the cost of living and inflation, et cetera, he's got nothing. And we need better than that. So that was the thinking. And I think that puts Keir Starmer in quite a different position. For a long time, the Labour Party has really tried out to destruction, I think, the notion that Tories are bad people, rather than just they're wrong, or they're seized by a poor theory or a bad account of what progress is, or something which is a better criticism. And so there was a concerted attempt in that speech, as the main expression of it, to was a bit more generous in a funny way.
Yeah. Can I ask you one other? By the way, I just wanted to give a nod to my colleagues, Liz Mosley, who pointed out that Gove has disappeared recently, and in the chat, Mark St Andrews' observation that nightclubs have reopened. Great to hear while you were speaking. Phil, just before I come to Matt, one other thing I just wanted to ask you about was when I was watching Blair versus Brown, in which, not Blair versus Brown, sorry, it was called Blair and Brown, wasn't it?
That was the real title. Yeah.
That's a slip. Blair and Brown. There's a moment, I can't remember whether I think you show up in the fourth or fifth episode. And it was amazing, by the way, just sort of reliving the moment of that final conference speech and your commentary on it. But one of the things that Blair reflected on at the very end was the party never really liked me. They liked me when I was winning, but they never really liked me. And when I was up in Newcastle and Boris was giving that speech, the Peppa Pig speech that Eleanor mentioned, there was this weird realization that Boris, in terms of is enormously liked by the party for his personality, but increasingly not for his policies. And I wonder how precarious you think that is, or whether the read across of Blair and Labour and Johnson and the Conservative Party is a stretch.
No, I absolutely had the same thought when I was watching the documentary. I think there is a difference in that the Labour Party is a more doctrinal party, and the Conservative Party is a more intrinsically flexible and adaptable beast. And as you pointed out in your introduction, the Tory party is unrecognisable from the premiership of someone who was in the year above Boris Johnson at school. So they've changed political direction even within a kind of cohort within a certain school. So they are a remarkably flexible beast, but I think he will push them. I think that they will struggle to take some of the things. I think the obvious signs of tension between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are there and will open up. So I do think there is something in the analogy, because Boris Johnson is on sufferance on the Tory party precisely because he's a winner. Now, there's another difference there, which is the Tory party tends to like winners as a breed, and the Labour Party tends to dislike winners as a breed. I think I've told you before that the great story of when Blair went to the NEC for the very final time, and for his final words in front of the Labour's governing body, he said, "I'd just like to say that I was loyal to this party through 3 terrible defeats, and all I've ever asked in return is that you should be loyal to me through 3 terrible victories." And there was a sort of silence in the only relishes the purity of a glorious defeat because it's right. And the Tory party doesn't really feel that. The Tory party measures politics differently. So there are serious differences. However, I do think there's something in the fact that the Tory party will tolerate Boris Johnson's indiscretions as long as he's an obvious winner. And if he is an obvious winner, they'll stick with him. My own view is that they should stick with him because I think he's the only obvious winner they've got.
Let me go to Matt, and I'm sure lots of people will have points they want to make to Phil and Eleanor and Matt. But Matt, far away, I feel like this is your sort of, unfortunately for you, is probably your mastermind / pub quiz subject. Boris Johnson.
Yes. Well, actually, it's funny when you were asking the original question about what we've learned this year, and I was thinking about, I've had lots of conversations in 2021 about Boris Johnson and the economy. And, I never thought he had an economic plan, but it turns out he does. And to refer back to your point about sort of turning left after Brexit, as it were. But of course, the predictable bit, as opposed to the unpredictable bit, is that the plan doesn't turn out to have very much substance or kind of coherence. So the question really is whether what still isn't defined, the levelling up agenda, will have a sufficient appeal and coherence and rigour to it to bring over those Tories who are still very uncertain about a lot of it, not only the notion of essentially the South subsidising the North, higher taxes and so on, and an obsession with building bridges and airports and ponds and infrastructure of all sorts. So that there is that. I mean, it has been surprising how clear that is, if only as a sort of temperamental thing, and as Phil referred to, the ever greater chasm between Rishi Sunak and the Prime Minister is now developing a kind of traditional number 10 versus number 11 pulse, which it's worth remembering. It was only early 2020 that Rishi Sunak was brought in by number 10 because Sajid Javid was considered to be dangerously independent-minded chancellor. And now Sunak, the supposed number 10 stooge, is very much on manoeuvres as the next leader. I guess my feeling this year was that, I mean, I've always kind of not been able to quite make up my mind if Boris is Mr. Blobby or the Terminator. He always looks like he's about to fall over, and then suddenly he just keeps going. He just keeps going. And to change the metaphor violently, he's had this sort of Teflon quality for years. And I suppose, I don't want to overstate it, but this was the year when I think, at the very least, the Teflon started to cease to operate quite so magically. And there have been moments when he has bled politically. I mean, you mentioned the CBI speech. That was remarkable. And the whole debacle of sleaze, though again, I agree with Phil, one mustn't overstate it. I don't think that has yet translated into a huge sort of readiness on the part of the public to kick him out of Downing Street. Nonetheless, it got through, it cut through. I find the extent to which the Christmas party story has continued to remain an obsession fascinating, because I think it's all to do with the fact that we'll put up with lies but not with hypocrisy, which I find a fascinating distinction.
Matt, can I just ask you one thing? Sorry, just sort of, forgive me cutting in. The one fear I've got in this, and given that we cooked up the idea of having this conversation together, it's slightly embarrassing to have second thoughts as we just get into it, is how much do you think that the arguments around Boris Johnson are essentially the personification of an argument about structural change in the UK, that
very much
we've decided we want to be Denmark, but we haven't admitted it, and that's the reason why these conversations seem so
very, very much, and it's confusing because he is, and we know from his conversations with Dominic Cummings, he loves chaos. The chaos is his brand, and so it's very difficult when you have a figure who personifies chaos to try and see sort of stable symbolism in him. But I think you're absolutely right. He's a consequential prime minister through no fault of his own, if you like, in the sense that he does absolutely represent whatever happens now. There will be pre-Boris and post-Boris Britain, and at our peril do we forget that, because the worst possible response to the Boris Johnson era by the centre left is to think, let's go back to the pre-Boris disposition. Just as in America, the worst possible response to Trump is, let's just go back to the way things were before Trump. You have to build a post-Trump settlement, just as you have to build a post-Johnson settlement. And that is still a project in its infancy. In terms of his, just going back to the lessons of 2021, I was talking yesterday to someone who knows him very well, still works with him very closely, and says, look, he's okay until COVID goes. And I thought that was a very kind of depressing, but probably true way of looking at it. And I think by when COVID goes, this person meant when we stop having the kind of flurries of can we get boosters, what about Omicron, rows we're having at them, and obsessive internalized arguments we're having at the moment. I think governments, however badly they may be performing within those arguments, benefit from the idea that they are the government during a crisis. The point this person was trying to make was, once the COVID crisis really is in the rear view mirror, even if COVID remains endemic, then we really have to start delivering on, levelling up. We've got the culture war. They're ratcheting up law and order, and that's very noticeable. And I think the reason for that is that, final thought is that, like Phil, I don't think that this is by any means even the beginning of the end, but the rust has started to set in, and the most obvious factor about rust is it never sleeps. So once it's set in, then it is you start to see the lineaments of how it will end. And I think this was the year in which we started to see that, but it could be a very long time. The factors that led to Thatcher's downfall were obvious from about 1981,
And Matt, just on that, we were talking about this earlier. If people joining us today haven't had a chance to listen to Matt's kind of really amazingly depressing piece of reporting about 11 days in August, the UK withdrawal from Kabul, do go and listen to it, because it's extraordinary in the detail about how British government effectively worked or went on holiday in August. It's interesting about the UK relationship with the US. But one of the things that crept up on me, Matt, and I suppose we touched on right at the beginning of this conversation, was that this is not a 2-year-old government. This is a 10, 11-year-old government, and it's tired and crotchety and has built up a bunch of resentments with each other. One of the things you'll hear if you listen to Matt's reporting is just the level, the extent to which Ben Wallace and Dominic Raab were at each other's throats and using the machinery of government. One would win and one would lose, and in the end Dominic Raab was the one that lost. And there was a kind of, if you like, a military cabal of Tories and a sort of foreign office diplomatic cabal of Tories, and they really have grown to distrust and dislike each other. How much is that one other element of what's happened in Boris Johnson's government? It's not just the number 10, number 11 division, that there are these new divisions at the very top of government that have probably not been fully explained or explored. But I think it's a huge element, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the great and most successful illusions of this government, which, as you say, has existed in one form or another since 2010, an incredibly long haul, is that post-2016, and particularly, obviously, post-2019, when Johnson entered Downing Street, it was able to reinvent itself as effectively a new government, a new kind of government. It was the Brexit government, or the Boris government, or whatever you wanted to describe it as. And as we too easily forget, one of the first things that the Boris Johnson government did was to purge cabinet and parliamentary ranks of anyone who disagreed with them on Brexit. So there was a kind of change, and that gave the impression of something that, even in a nasty sense, was dynamic and new and different. But as you say, these are actually in the end the same old, people, the same old parliamentary party, and they all hate each other, and they've been staring across each tables of various sorts, ministerial tables, since 2010, or select committee tables or whatever. And some of those views are now pretty well advanced. And as you said, the Ben Wallace, Dominic Raab feud's just an example. Defence Secretary versus former Foreign Secretary, now Justice Secretary.
is a very good one. You know, watch the hatreds that are emerging around Liz Truss. I heard someone at the Treasury grumbling the other day that, you know, Liz Truss never goes on the radio or TV. That, you know, it's left to others to go out and be the human shield for the government. You know, whereas Raab, for all his flaws, is a sort of human punchback. He did the rounds on Sunday, and he was back on the Today programme talking rubbish this morning, and that gives him some credit in Number 10, which is not nothing. But absolutely, I mean, they are so sick of the sight of each other, and they all want to be Prime Minister. They can't wait for him to go. But to Phil's point, none of them are absolutely sure that they would be able to win an election, with the possible exception of Liz Truss, who I think has that absolutely bizarre, strange, elemental self-confidence that Boris Johnson does.
You're missing a particular treat at this moment. As you describe Liz Truss, my colleague Liz Mosley's face is a picture. I hope you're all enjoying the screen. It's a very heavy breathing out that you're doing there, Liz. So thank you for the. But other than just emoting on the Liz Truss issue, you were making a point about sort of the culture of politics, the culture of corporates. How do you see it? Where have you gone? Have you got?
I'm trying to. Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Yes, I just was reflecting on. I spent the best part of 20 years working in big corporate companies and observed that the people who did well in those environments were not the people who were the ones that placed the biggest bets. They were the people that avoided the biggest disasters. And I just wonder if perhaps when people were sort of talking about, you know, what are his ideas really, and you know, what is there a policy platform? And you know, Trump nearly won in America without any sort of policy platform particularly to run on, and that was all I was imagining, because Boris, I think, is more symbolic than a leader, to just what Matt was just saying, that you don't really hear from him. I mean, the speech we'll all remember, of course, is Peppa Pig, but there aren't that many other occasions. We remember him not wearing a mask in Hexham. We remember him not wearing a mask when he's sitting next to David Attenborough. There's not that much sort of meat and potatoes of Boris to remember, but yet he sort of casts a long shadow, and I think that is a shtick that is typical more of the corporate world perhaps than the political one.
Just, I'm going to go to Robert Lester and then William Jeremy in a second. Eleanor, do you recognise what Liz is saying, that weirdly, for quite such a historic year, there are a few moments of the Prime Minister that are really kind of indelibly memorable?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, off the top of my head, I'd say the main things that I remember, you know, the flat renovations, the Peppa Pig speech from recently, the not wearing a mask on those couple of occasions, and there have been, I feel like, a few sort of key moments like that have been, you know, talked about for weeks at a time, while I don't know, it feels it feels almost quite sneaky. I know that there was all this speculation, which I thought was really silly actually, back when was it that he was talking about how he likes to paint buses as a hobby?
Yes.
That he deliberately said something so absurd to deflect from I actually can't remember what it was. But supposedly he was deflecting from something scandalous by you know, giving this completely absurd soundbite about painting buses. And I don't know, if I was more conspiracy minded, I'd say that he does all these ridiculous things to deflect from all the more sinister things that aren't so reported on. But I think he does ridiculous things because he's ridiculous. I think you're right, Eleanor. I think I'm not sure it's that deep.
Yeah, I think this stuff is instinctive rather than calculating. Let me bring in a couple of other people, and I'm going to want to come back to you and also to Phil too. Robert Lester. Oh, Robert, before you start, will you just make sure you're unmuted? Oh, there you are. We got you.
So just to offer a slightly different school report from that we've heard so far. Let me be clear that I'm not a great fan of Boris Johnson, but let me just try this out. So, yeah, there's no doubt he's a chancer. There's no doubt that he's impulsive. There's no doubt that he's economical with the truth. And there's no doubt that he has poor judgment, and he's illustrated that this year. But if you say, what's he doing, or what's he associated with in terms of some of the big issues that government can influence, let me suggest that he might, in his school report, get 4 ticks. So the first tick would be on climate. Now, you could say, well, that was all just, again, opportunism because we were hosting COP26. But having sat on the Council for Science and Technology for 5 years, which is the Prime Minister's advisory group on science, I genuinely think he's got the climate issue and takes it seriously and really wants to do something about it and wants the UK to provide leadership. So I'd give him a tick on climate. Second point, I forget who it was that said this, it might have been you, Richard, that I do think he wants to do something about the geographical economic inequalities in the UK. I don't think he knows how to do it, and there's a lack of substance point, I accept that, but I think he does want to do something about it. And there's definitely a left leaning, and that's, to me, if I've learned something this year, that's been a surprise. A third point is, I mean, he is a man of liberal values, and that's not just how he runs his private life. I think genuinely he is a man of liberal values, and for a Tory leader, I appreciate that. And the fourth tick is that I genuinely think he's pro-science. Now, that's the world that I come from, so maybe I'd give that more emphasis than others on this call. But it may have started with our erstwhile colleague Dominic Cummings, but I think Boris has stayed with it, and I think they are trying very hard to maintain the commitment to 2.4% of GDP on R&D, despite all the horrible financial pressures that they're dealing with. So I'd give him a tick on that. So there's my attempt to salvage a slightly different school report with 4 ticks, despite I don't really disagree with anything very much that's been said.
Robert, can I just check 2 things on that? One is, one of the surprises that economically having turned left, right, arguably culturally, in terms of values, turned right. You know, all of the retain and explain policies around the big museums, the response to everything from Rule Britannia to statues has felt quite unlike the Metropolitan Mayor that was in London a decade ago. So what made you think liberal values in 2021?
Yeah, okay, so maybe I'm taking my liberal values back a bit too far, but he's always, I think he was very early supporter of gay marriage. So yeah, maybe this is not a 2021 observation, but I just think it's genuinely true. Liberal values straying into libertarian, and of course that's why, one of the reasons I think why he genuinely struggled with lockdowns. And of course, the UK's fatal mistake was that we were 3 weeks too late with the first lockdown, and we've never really recovered from that because the numbers we've never got on top of the numbers. So I think, maybe that's not liberal values, it's libertarian, but so I think it's fair to challenge me on that one in terms of 2021.
Okay, well, listen, I'm going to want to get a few more thoughts and views if I can. I'm going to come to Zoe Blakemore in a second and Nico McDonald, but I see William Jeremy, you've got a hand up. William. There you go, William. Hello.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I think we've learned that Boris is even more like himself and all those things that we knew about him before. We know he's a brilliant phrase maker, and his primary constituency is what you could call the Daily Telegraph readers and wider. And he thinks in terms of articles and headlines and ideas generally. We also know that his chief cause is himself, and that his headmasterly report from all those years saying actually here is a boy who really feels the rules don't apply to him. And I think that's generally the case. I'm with Robert on his liberal values generally and his attachment to the real issue of climate, because that's an inherited issue from his father, remember. And I think in terms of the wider Conservative Party, this stuff about the bigger state and spending more rather than the smaller state taps into a long Conservative tradition or Tory party tradition in government that says, well, we intellectually want a smaller state, but we actually know that we're not really in the business of the smaller state. So he's less Bertie Wooster and more a little bit Harold Macmillan, a little bit Bill Deeds, and I think a little bit sort of slightly hapless Peppa Pig liking. I suppose Fred Flintstone. But
that's very much. I'm trying to push this idea that he's much more Jacques Tati, Monsieur Hulot's holiday.
Oh yeah.
But maybe we'll keep trading these, William. Can I before I go and just ask Nico and Zoe what they think? Phil, can I just come back to you for a second, because a number of people have asked different questions about policy. Do you remember that thing? And James Wilson is saying, does it make any difference that it hasn't really landed yet? And I remember years ago us having a conversation about the big society. And I remember being very excited by this. This seemed like a brilliant thing. And I think I remember you saying something along the lines of, that's great. You go and build a big society. I've got to pick the kids up from school. And I wonder whether or not levelling up is going to end up being as much of a political MacGuffin as the big society, or whether or not that's just kind of awful journalistic skepticism and there really is a material reorientation of policy and country that we're going to see unfold next year.
Well, I think levelling up is a real thing. I think it's a real substantive problem. So I don't dismiss it as nothing. However, your skepticism is warranted because it's incredibly difficult. One of the things that the Blair-Brown documentary did not find room for, even after 5 programs, was the enormous amount of money and time that was expended on what we called neighbourhood renewal, which today you'd call levelling up. It is not true that the reason some areas are, quote, left behind is because they have somehow been neglected or forgotten. If only that were true, if only it were that easy. Actually, it's much more difficult and worrying than that, which is to say that a well-intentioned government over many years doing what it could and spending a lot of taxpayers' money to try and level up obviously failed. Now, what that is telling you is that Johnson has set himself the toughest exam question of all. I don't doubt the government's bona fides. I don't doubt their integrity and their sincerity in wanting to do it, not just for electoral reasons. Neither do I doubt that in Michael Gove they got the right person on the job, because I think he's the government's most fertile policy thinker. So no doubt some good will be done, just as it was in the neighbourhood renewal years from 1997 onwards. But the idea that by the time of the next election, enough people will have been able to witness enough change in their lives, I think is highly unlikely. So as a piece of politics, it's a very difficult thing to do, which is why they're thinking, well, let's try and set the test of levelling up as whether there are a few more hanging baskets in Bury Town Centre, because we've got to have some measure that people can see, because the task they're setting themselves is extraordinarily complex and difficult.
All right, well, that's very interesting. And from the policy to the personal, Matt, one other thing too is, did I learn in 2021 whether or not Boris Johnson is a Roman Catholic? And does it matter? That I don't know.
Well, you didn't learn, because I don't think any of us really did, including probably himself. I'm sure it's quite likely he still thinks he's C of E or something. but I mean, it is the case that he got married in you know, the nation's grandest Catholic church, so that must count for something. If he did become a Catholic, having a couple of divorces behind you is not nothing in the Catholic Church, and so I'd be intrigued how that was got round. You may remember from Brideshead Revisited that Rex Mottram couldn't marry Lady Julia Flight because he had been divorced. So whilst I'm not suggesting that, you know, that's a political textbook we should cling to, it is nonetheless well, perhaps we should, I don't know, but doctrinally it's a bit iffy in the Catholic world without an annulment, and I doubt even Boris could swing two before he got married to Carrie. So I think that Boris's relationship with God is probably very complicated, because as with Churchill, I mean, he wrote, as you know, what was before Andrew Roberts' single volume on Churchill, the best-selling single volume book on Churchill ever. Unfortunately, if for those who've read it, have had to read it, it is really a work of autobiography, because it's about how Churchill was really just paving the way for Boris. And so, you know, now, and as we know, he's meant to be writing a book on Shakespeare, who I imagine falls into the same category on the literary side of things. So God, who in the world of politics, let's face it, is pretty big on a kind of cosmic scale, I'm sure his relationship with God is also pretty complicated, because as big as God is he as big as Boris? You know, you have to wonder, has he got
but I mean, it is a very interesting thing. I mean, this is a digression. I'm one of the few people who's interested in this stuff, but I think the fact that our politics is so divorced from religion that it's possible to either have chosen to take up a religion or to be married in that faith without taking it up.
Yeah,
both of those things are important choices, but we have no access to knowledge of that. It seems amazing to me when we're having big debates about, for example, assisted dying, not to know those things about the thinking of the Prime Minister.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And as we know, it was, you know, much more important to Tony Blair's thinking than he was really allowed to say very often at the time. I mean, I do actually know a little bit about Boris's real religious beliefs from a very, very an odd conversation I had with him when he was editor of the Spectator in the back garden of the Spectator one evening. We were just chewing the cud, and he told me that he really, if he had any real kind of beliefs in the divine, they were the gods of the classical world. You know, he believed in the sort of capricious, rather spiteful, you know, kind of whimsical gods who entered human affairs at whim, and you know, sometimes to catastrophic, sometimes to beneficial effect. But that was the kind of he's very pagan, and genuinely believes, and people find this hard to believe, but he genuinely believes that all wisdom is to be found in Homer. And one of the strangest things about that aspect of him is he's fantastically superstitious. So you'll be walking down the street with him, and he'll see a number plate which has numbers in it which he thinks are, you know, an ill-omened, ill starred for him, and he'll walk across the street. So he genuinely, he's like something out of The Secret History. He really does believe in that world. I mean, he's pre-Christian.
Okay, that's it's an odd thing to wait to get to the very, very end of the year to learn something truly new and utterly revealing that just happened. So thank you, Matt. Zoe, you were going to say something. Blakemore, you had a point, and Nico MacDonald was going to weigh in. Zoe.
I think Chris and I were having more of an exchange about why Keir Starmer wasn't jumping on the PPE corruption, and I think that Boris will come to rue the Owen Patterson scenario, because I think that will end up being the tipping point that allows, once all the facts of the PPE corruption come out, to really build on the corruption angle. I think Matt said a few weeks ago, we forget just how long it took for the Cash for Questions momentum to build. It was over a number of years. And I think that he will really, really rue what he did with Owen Patterson.
You know what, Zoe, we had a conversation, one of our daily news conferences, the 10:30 meeting. And I came in one day and I said, you know what, isn't this Owen Patterson story one of those inside Westminster stories that no one's going to care about externally? Literally the room just went up in a chorus of disagreement, all saying, no, you're completely wrong. And I totally misread that. Owen Patterson's been one of those things that has really lodged and kind of opened the door for lots of other things that are retrospective, including 2020 Christmas party, but all of that. I think you're right, and I think a lot of those questions, you know, we haven't fully got into some of the fundamental questions about, you know, corruption in politics. I expect that will be a theme of 2022. Nico MacDonald, you wanted to make a different point, I thought, the light of the John Gray piece. Yeah, Nico, hi.
Hi there. Well, just on the Catholicism issue, in noughties, every leader of the major parties, Charles Kennedy and Duncan Smith, Tony Blair, were all of the high faith, which was a unprecedented triumvirate since Catholics could only sit in Parliament from the 1820s. So some progress has been made. Well, I wanted to pick up on Philip's comment about the Conservative Party and its lack of principles, which you can see every time a Conservative minister is asked whether you know, schools will ever be closed again or lockdown instituted and so on, and none of them will ever commit to the idea of freedom, which I thought was quite fundamental both in trade and in individual liberty to the Conservatives. And it does seem the Conservatives have gone not just in the space of two leaders, but one administration, from being the champion of what I call the British deplorables, i.e. people who voted Brexit and wanted to leave the EU, on which Johnson rode to power, to essentially being an advocate, I would say, of what is often called the professional managerial class, which has both supported lockdown, partly because it can work from home and have liberty while everyone else has to go out to work, and can have the virtue of telling other people to wear masks when it doesn't have to. But also around climate change, which obviously I know is a controversial issue and so on, but actually what climate change is supported by a very small, at least the measures the Conservatives advocate are supported by a very small proportion of the population, unlike Brexit, and threaten to impoverish people and implement a sort of acceptable austerity. So I think it's very interesting that he's gone from being what would be disparagingly called a populist, or I think that term's misused a lot, to being a supporter of a very minorly supported cause, and almost the inverse of what he came in on. I would say he has taken on the culture wars, or at least Kemi Badenoch has been sent out to bat on that on a few occasions. So, you know, in some senses, he's not entirely going down the professional managerial class agenda, but it's a very weak kind of counterposition, if you like. So I think it's a remarkable transformation, to be honest, and it'll be very interesting to see how things play out when the consequences of lockdown, particularly, and in fact climate change policies, which we're both seeing now, people not being able to afford heating, infrastructure breaking down, and people recognizing how much impact a policy that was really not debated with the British people is having, or has had and is having post hoc. I think those will be the big things, really, which will frame the next election.
There is a, if you're unfortunate enough to spend a lot of time in the Tortoise newsroom, you'll know that almost any conversation that I sit in eventually has to be steered back to a discussion of inflation. And so even now, taking what's quite a lively and interesting conversation about policy, politics, Brexit, the personality of Boris Johnson, I'm afraid I have to do 5 minutes on inflation. Because I wonder, Eleanor and Phil, I'm going to go with you first, whether or not you think that pressure on living conditions, higher interest rates, uncertainty about our economic future, confidence in the central bank, all of those things play, in the end, well or badly for a Conservative Prime Minister. Eleanor?
Play well or badly? That's interesting.
So the argument that the well argument, the logic is, of course, it plays badly. The argument for well is we'd rather, in these uncertain times, deal with conservatives who have a reputation for economic confidence, and they'll see us through.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, we all know that it's the Conservatives who over the past decade have got us to this point in the first place. So I think, so thinking, oh, well, you know, they have brought us to this point, but they're the only ones who can get us out of it, seems odd. But yeah, I'm really uncertain about what the British people want at this point. I think that's what has become extremely clear to me, is that I honestly, I can theorize, but have no idea.
That is really, by the way, that's the most honest thing I think anyone said all year, possibly ever in my life. I think it's, well, I'm going to go to Phil. Phil too. What do you think in terms of the politics of inflation?
I mean, I don't know either, but I think two things I can say. One is that whether or not it plays well or badly depends firstly on whether the Labour Party is in a place where it's possible to accept that the Labour Party might be a viable custodian of economic policy, which it obviously hasn't been for quite a long time. And so a government can get away with being loose on economic policy, and even with things which are materially detrimental to the public if the opposition is a basket case. To that extent, I think the CBI speech and the Peppa Pig moment was probably an important moment, because it signalled a moment of the Labour Party leader giving a sober, clear speech to an important economic constituency, in contrast to the Prime Minister. And I think Keir Starmer has moved the Labour Party quite a long way in this respect. I think Rachel Reeves is a serious person, an absolutely credible, possible Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I think Labour Party is in a different place, which means they might be the recipients of some of that discontent. But then there is then a much bigger question in your behind your question, which absolutely warrants you bringing us back to inflation, which is that in any other era of politics, we would absolutely have assumed that a period of inflation would have some serious political ramifications. We might discuss whether they were good or bad for certain parties, but we wouldn't be in any doubt that this would be a political event of the first order. But we are in doubt about that very question now, because we've just gone through an election, 2019, where questions of income and occupation and economic status were not the primary questions. And we look in the United States, we look in France, we look in Germany, and we see that politics is being organized with affiliations along cultural lines. And this is the big question for the next year, it seems to me, is whether or not we get the return of something conventional, which is a major economic event translating directly into a major political event. I don't know the answer to that. I find it very difficult to believe it won't. So I find myself thinking that something like some kind of conventional relationship will reapply, but I'm very wary of that, because I take very seriously the changes that have happened over the last 3 or 4 years. I'm frightened that I'm trapped in an old way of thinking. So I would end up in a way in the same position as Ellen, which I don't know, but I think that's the question I'm going to be watching for over the next year.
Matt, I'm going to come to you for a final thought and to wrap up, and if you like, lead us into who we look for, who we what we watch in 2022. But before I do, I just want to invite Jonathan Lass to make a comment, because I think there are lots of people who share the sentiment that Jonathan put in the chat, and I heard it from really unlikely places, Jonathan. I mean, I was in a very, very kind of gathering of the Grand the other day, and people were expressing something quite similar to you. So just tell us a little bit how you see things.
Well, what I was saying was that we're seeing in the last couple of years, and particularly this year with Boris, I've never ever seen it in our political leadership before, but disrespect for rules, changing them halfway through the game, as they did with Owen Patterson, a breakdown in standards in public life and public discourse. And we saw that every time there's been an independent report of the standards individual and so on numerous government departments. Boris ignores it on bullying with Priti Patel, and then he ignores the report, and the person who writes the report resigns. You know, one of the chief legal officers resigned over Brexit. Conflicts of interest, sleaze, all these things, and now we're seeing even more seriously, in a way, challenges to the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. And as featured in the Times yesterday, what the government's trying to do on judicial review, to try and limit access of people, where the whole purpose of judicial review is to rein in maladministration and let the courts see whether ministers have actually done stuff that's unlawful, as they did with the proroguing of Parliament and so on. And then criticizing the Supreme Court and getting the media, the right-wing media, to do that as well. And that, I think, is a very pernicious situation. I think it really does raise questions about the health of our democracy, and I'd be interested to see how people react to that.
Jonathan, thank you. Matt, takes to the bridge. What's your final thought on Boris Johnson in 2021 and where it leads us in 2022?
Well, thanks, James. I think the most interesting question I've seen posted in the chat was, would he fight the next election? And I believe he will, because I think that gene within him that just is Nietzschean and consumed by a will to power, unless he's got some, I don't know, I mean, conceivably some sort of long COVID or, real after effects of last year that prevents him physically from doing so, which we don't know that he does. I think he will fight on, and he's got a considerable advantage. I think the big question is, okay, I think we've all established that 2021 was a year in which something changed, that he is no longer an invulnerable character. I think the really interesting question for 22 is, do people, there are two things. I mean, will people who started to get critical around the edges, like Tom Tugendhat, like Tobias Ellwood, the chair of the Defence Committee, like Angela Richardson, Gove's PPS, who resigned over Owen Patterson and then was brought back into the fold, and some of the Red Wall MPs, will a critical mass emerge with people saying, actually, this is not what Toryism is about? Fascinating to watch that. And the final thing, and I think it goes back to the whole question of which you and Phil were talking about, which is the relationship between economics and culture. And the more I think about this, the more I think that they're the same question, which is that what's happened is, it's not that there's a choice between identity politics on the one hand, elections governed thereby, or economic elections, but they've become hideously entangled. And so the really interesting thing is, what we're about to witness is a big political experiment, which is probably economic. The main economic metrics are going to get pretty frisky for the government. The question is the takeaway from that what we would have traditionally have expected, which is the government's fault, and to some degree they pay for it, or will it feed into the rather more toxic culture war debates that have now become, very much part of the warp and weft of political life, and ironically bolster the incumbents? Now, I genuinely don't know the answer to it, but I think they are not separate strands in politics now. They are intimately connected.
Matt, thank you. Phil and Eleanor, thank you too. I'll leave you with one final thought, which is my observation for 2020 and 2021, possibly even since 2017, is that foreign policy has not been much of a feature in the life of the British Prime Minister. My suspicion is, given China, Russia, Iran, it will be in 2022, either directly or by some proxy. And we haven't seen any of that yet. So thank you all for joining us. Thanks for everyone for weighing in the chat, for weighing in the conversation. This leaves us with a good number of things to pursue and think about as we start planning for our think-ins, for our slow newscasts, and for our sense makers, and the whole range of journalism we've got in mind for 2022. Thank you so much for making the time to join us, and have a very good evening.